And you know what, for right now, I'm just going to have a seat there. Not sure what I want to do, but here's another water if you need it. Okay. I mean, obviously, we got an investigation to do, so I got to go over your Miranda rights just because we're talking to you, we're talking to a lot of people, okay?
I've done it for myself.
If this stillness holds you, a quiet gesture helps sustain these long-form investigations. Taking a moment to like the video or subscribe allows stories like this to be examined with the time and care they demand, bringing hidden truths into focus, one layer at a time.
I'll tell you what, from the beginning, let's just start off from when you got up this morning until the time you pull up at the house. Just kind of walk me through that first,
Okay.
and then we'll go through and kind of explain, talk about some different things as far as the emails you've been getting, okay?
Well, I set my alarm clock for 5:30, and I used my phone for my alarm clock. And got up at 5:30, went in the bathroom, put these clothes here I got on, and went to the bathroom, basically got in the truck and left. And drove off. I got to where I was at, but called Sherry to wake her up, get her going, and she didn't answer, of course. And so I went on to the gym, to Gold's Gym, and over by Ronnie's Plaza in South County, and started working out. I text her at some point. I might even called her again. I don't remember. I could probably look at my phone if you want me to.
Did you guys have a home?
The house is quiet in a way that feels rehearsed. Morning light settles across a suburban street where nothing appears disturbed, where cars remain parked neatly and lawns hold their shape. The stillness does not suggest sleep. It suggests interruption. Something has halted the ordinary progression of a weekday before it could announce itself. Doors remain closed. Windows reflect the sky without revealing what lies behind them. In places like this, routine is everything. Days are measured by departure times, by familiar movements repeated without thought. Breakfast is prepared. Children are ushered through doorways. Work awaits with predictable urgency. The absence of these movements creates a vacuum that feels heavier than noise. It is not the presence of something wrong that draws attention first, but the absence of what should be there. This is how unease begins, not with panic, but with discrepancy, with the recognition that the expected sequence has failed to occur. The street itself offers no explanation. It holds its breath, unchanged, as though unaware that its ordinary rhythm has been broken. Inside the house, time has stopped unevenly. Some rooms remain exactly as they were left, suspended mid-purpose. Objects sit where hands last placed them, unaware they will never be used again. The quiet is not peaceful. It presses inward, dense with finality. Whatever occurred here did not announce itself to the outside world. It unfolded privately, within walls built to contain safety. Safety in this environment was assumed. It was built into the design of the neighborhood, into the predictability of its residents, into the belief that danger announced.
Phone number 2 or just cell phones?
We just use cell phones. So I text her, and then she still didn't respond, and probably now it had to have been well after 6 o'clock sometime when I texted her or called her. I'm sure it's still on her phone what time it was.
Okay.
And she didn't respond, and it's not like her because the kids should have been up and stuff, or getting up and going by then, I believe. And so I called her again called her again on the way back, or when I was getting ready to leave, and she didn't respond again, and I started getting a little concerned because it's not like her not to answer the phone. Sometimes she won't answer if she's in the shower, but she always calls me back right away. And so she didn't do that at all, and so that's when I called you.
And so what time did you text her back? The second time?
I can tell you.
6:23. So at 6:23 a.m. is when you first texted her this morning. It says, "Hey baby, are you awake?" Does that sound right?
Had you tried to call before that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can pull up the call log too if you want me.
Okay, that just does text. I'm sorry. All right, so you're just looking at the text, and how are those out, Justin? Did you go through?
So the first one is from you. It says, "Hey baby, are you awake?"
6:23. I'm sorry.
6:23 a.m. And then and she doesn't respond to you, correct?
It would be on there.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay. Okay. And so the second one from you says, "I know you was tired last night." 6:23 says, "I have about 5 minutes left on cardio, then I'll be home." And she never responded to any of them because I could tell. Yeah, I could tell on the phone.
Okay.
And then at 7:27 it says, "Hello, you up?"
7:27.
I'm sorry, 6:27. 6:27. And then at the same time at 6:27, another one goes out and says, "Time to get the kids up." Anything as far as that sticks out in your mind from this morning? I mean, when you left, did you notice anything?
No. The only thing I told somebody was the only thing I can remember is having to slow down for a car backing out of the driveway. That's it.
From the which driveway were they backing out?
I don't know. He asked me the same thing. It was like 3 or 4 up. I don't know. On the left-hand side. That's the only thing I remember.
You notice anything about the car?
It was just a darker color. The only thing. I'm sorry. I should have been more observant.
I mean, anything that sticks out? I mean, were you able to tell like what kind of car it was? I mean, did you recognize it in the neighborhood at all? Or?
No, I was just backing out of the driveway. I didn't even see.
Those, kind of going back to when you first came here back in November last year, you were getting some of those emails sent to your work email address, right? Do you still have those on your computer?
I could look.
Okay.
They might be on the server. Even.
Okay.
I doubt if they're on the computer because it deletes them after so long.
Kind of purges them out, type of thing.
But I would think they'd be on the server.
And how many threats like that? I mean, up until November, have you ever gotten threats like that before?
No, people have been upset with me, but I haven't gotten anything. I mean, I've had people yell at me and cuss at me and everything else, but, you know, and escort them off the property and all that stuff, you know. If I just been there this morning, leave.
What we're gonna do, you know, Chris, we're gonna get past that. Okay, we're gonna work this out and get through it. All right.
Do you have any paint at your house?
I think so.
No, don't.
I don't think so.
Okay. Any spray paint?
If I do, it's old. We kind of talked about the divorce a little bit.
This last December?
Yeah. And I went to Joyce with it, told her about it, or Danny, I can't remember which one. And they knew about it, and they suggested that we meet with somebody and see if we could work out whatever it was. And really all it was just communication, not communicating very well. And so...
Did you meet with somebody?
Yeah, Mike Shepard, the guy that's here downstairs in the lobby.
Okay.
He's and we've been meeting with him pretty regularly, and things have been going pretty awesome.
How often do you meet with him? I mean, you said regularly.
He travels overseas a lot too, and so as often as me and him schedule, I'd say on average maybe once a week.
We've got when you left the house this morning, was your wife alive?
Oh yeah.
What would you say if I told you that I don't think she was?
I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I think she was. I mean, she was.
Okay.
She was laying right beside me.
Right. And I'm not doubting that. I'm not doubting that you were there, and I'm not doubting that you care. But I am doubting that she was alive when you left this morning. Physically, what we have are different ways to tell how long a person's been deceased. That was done. And what do you think that showed?
I don't know. I guess the time frame when I was gone. I mean,
No, you this wrong. Chris, we need to get this resolved, okay? That you can't argue with physical evidence.
Right. I'm not trying to argue with it.
All
I
right.
don't.
What I'm telling you is there is no other explanation. There's no other reason that the information we have would support what you're telling us. That it can't. It can't. You've told us a story and we've gone over it numerous times.
Right.
You know what? We walk out to Justin, maybe we missed this. Let's go in and talk to him about this and just make sure that we're not missing something. Let's give him every opportunity to tell us exactly what happened and maybe we're missing something. So that's why we go out and we come back in and we go out and we come back in. I did have to use the restroom, that was legitimate, but we go out and we come back in. And we felt very comfortable that we were giving you every opportunity to tell us something that was going to contradict the information that we had. All right, we've got this information, you're saying it, and we're giving you opportunity to give us something contrary to what you told us before, so that, okay, yeah, all right, that would make sense. That hasn't happened.
I'm just telling you
That
what
hasn't
happened.
happened. Listen, man, she wasn't alive when you left.
She was alive. She
wasn't.
was. She was laying right beside
Listen
me.
to me. We can go back and forth with this all day long, but the physical evidence doesn't lie, man. She was not alive when you left this morning. The children weren't alive when you left this morning.
Yes, they were.
No, come on, Chris.
They
We gotta get over this. Now there's reasons, and that's the point we're at. I wanna hear the reasons. Now is when we need to find out what happened, man. It's so important. You're at a great point to be able to help us to try to figure this out. We already know what happened. We need to know why it happened.
I know
All right,
what to tell you.
listen, no, you do know what to tell us.
No, I don't.
Come on, Chris. She was not alive when you left. The children were not alive when you left. You know that's true, and I know that's true.
No, it just...
We need to clear this up now. We need to clear it up now. Did something happen? What happened?
Nothing happened.
What was going on in your life, Chris? Because I can't buy what you're saying. The physical evidence does not lie, Chris. It does not. She was not alive when you left, period. The physical evidence does not lie, man.
What do you want me to tell you?
The truth.
I'm telling you the truth.
How did we get to this point? That's what I need to know. I need to know how and why we got to the point we're at right now. We both know you're not telling me the truth. We both know that. I've done this a long time. I'm looking into your eyes and I can tell you you're not being truthful, Chris. We need an answer. There are answers. As bad as this sounds, as bad as this looks, or you may think it looks, we understand, and I've talked to many people who have given me reasons, and it's like, you know what, okay, all right, I can understand how somebody might have been feeling that at that time. And maybe they acted on it and they shouldn't have, and they regret it. There's no way to turn clocks back. You can't turn clocks back. You understand that, don't you?
Right.
You can't turn the clock back. The only thing we can do is go forward from this point, and we need to know what and why it happened. Come on, Chris, help me out with this.
I'm telling you, I've already told you. I've told everybody. I told the guy in the ambulance. I told you. I told him.
The more we go back like this, the more it makes me think that there maybe even isn't a good explanation for it. I mean, we need to know what happened. We can't keep going on this. It didn't, she was alive when I left. We know that's not true, and there's nothing we can do about changing that. If we know she wasn't alive when you left this morning, there's got to be an explanation. Now is the time to tell us. Now is the time to get this out in the open.
I don't know what else to tell you.
Yes, you do. Yes,
No.
you do. You have to tell me the truth, Chris.
I'm telling you the truth.
Were you involved in her death?
No.
Okay. Was someone you know involved in her death?
I don't know.
Did you know? Did you talk to anybody about arranging her death?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Itself clearly and arrives from elsewhere. The story that begins here dismantles that belief slowly, piece by piece. The place is suburban Illinois, early winter. The air carries the muted cold of a season that dulls sound and shortens days. Streets empty earlier. Evenings close in quickly. The rhythm of life contracts indoors into kitchens and living rooms where familiarity is meant to offer comfort against the dark. Within this house lived a family defined, outwardly, by normalcy. a father whose presence blended seamlessly into expectation, a mother whose days were shaped by care and routine, children whose lives revolved around school, play, and the assumption that home was the one place where nothing could fundamentally go wrong. Assumption is powerful. It allows attention to drift. It turns vigilance into background noise. It encourages the belief that what has always been true will remain true, without requiring verification. In this story, assumption functioned as insulation, protecting appearances while concealing fracture. The fracture did not appear overnight. It formed gradually, through tension that remained largely unseen, through pressures absorbed rather than expressed. To the outside world, the family existed within familiar boundaries: church, work, school, neighbors.
Thank you for coming tonight. As stated, we have some breaking news. We have made an arrest in the homicide of Sherry, Gavin, and Garrett Coleman. We have a Christopher Coleman in custody. He was charged late this evening with 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of his wife and his 2 small children. I'd just first like to say that thanks go out to these men and women. This is just a small piece of this investigation. This breaking news, we got some information tonight that secured the warrant, and we started making phone calls, and we had 20 officers here within 45 minutes. They showed their dedication towards this investigation, and we've done all we could to solve this as quickly as we could, but also as efficiently as we could. We feel very comfortable in these charges, and we just want to make the announcement. Mr. Coleman will be brought here for processing, and he will be then transferred to the Monroe County Jail later on this evening.
Where's he currently?
He may be here right now. I'm not really for sure. He's in transit. I'm sorry?
Is he turning himself in?
No, we went to his parents' home and placed him in custody there.
What changed between last week and this week?
I've been talking about how we were waiting on some forensic evidence, forensic testimony, different things, and it just all started coming together. And for several days now, we've been close. And it's just tonight there was just more evidence that came forward, and we were able to solidify just a more solid case. The prosecutor felt, as we did, that at this point there was enough time to charge him with these crimes, and it was brought before a judge late this evening. And the judge, after reviewing the evidence that we presented to them, agreed and issued this warrant for the 3 counts of homicide. Anytime.
Chris, are you good?
Chris, did you kill your wife? Chris, do you have any comment?
You have something to say to Sherry's family. Can you tell us a little something, Chris?
What about your kids, Chris? Anything you want to say about the same thing? Anything for your family, Chris? Any message at all?
Prosecutor Chris Reitz did not say much when asking for Chris Coleman's execution. Reitz did say Coleman felt them die, Your Honor. He's capable of strangling innocent children. Then defense attorney John O'Gara Jr. responded with a long monologue about our values as a society and how life in prison could be worse than death, saying, quote, he will die in prison. His cell is a 6 by 11-foot coffin that he'll share with another man 23 hours a day, subjected to his cruelties. O'Gara said this about his closing statement.
I probably waited 24 years to give that type of a closing argument, really, regarding the death penalty. I hope that we don't have it again in Illinois. Neither result would surprise me. If it got stayed away, I hope that it stays away.
Judge Milton Wharton said a decision to execute would be symbolic without leading to any closure. He gave Coleman life in prison without parole, calling the loss of freedom the most potent retribution. Columbia Police Chief Joseph Edwards believed if there's a case for execution, Chris Coleman was it, but he agreed it would not bring closure.
For anybody involved or associated with this case, closure does not happen when a 9-year-old, an 11-year-old, and their mother are murdered while they're in their bed in their home in the city of Columbia or anywhere else in any city.
These structures provided coherence and identity, reinforcing the image of stability. Stability, however, can be performative. It can exist as an outward condition sustained by effort rather than as an inward reality supported by alignment. When stability becomes performance, it demands silence. It requires that dissatisfaction be managed privately, that conflict be contained rather than explored. Containment was practiced here with discipline. It shaped interactions and expectations, narrowing what could be acknowledged openly. Over time, this narrowing altered perception itself, transforming strain into something to be endured rather than addressed. The cost of endurance accumulated quietly. Quiet accumulation is difficult to detect. It leaves no immediate trace. It allows daily life to continue uninterrupted. Responsibilities are met. Appearances are maintained. The internal world, however, begins to diverge from the shared one, constructing explanations and justifications in isolation. Isolation does not require distance. It can exist within proximity, within shared rooms and shared schedules. It thrives when communication becomes procedural rather than relational, when roles replace connection. In this environment, the internal narrative gains momentum without resistance. Momentum narrows possibility. As dissatisfaction grows without outlet, imagination shifts. It begins to focus less on repair and more on escape. The future is envisioned not as something to be negotiated collectively, but as something to be claimed individually. This shift is subtle. It does not announce itself as threat. It presents as resolve, as clarity, as the belief that endurance has reached its limit. Within this belief, extreme outcomes can begin to feel internally consistent. The day itself arrives without warning. There is no outward signal that anything will be different. Morning comes as it always does, indifferent to what has already been decided. The cold light enters rooms that will never be occupied again in the same way. The house does not resist what is about to occur. It holds it. What unfolds inside does not produce chaos audible to the street. It remains contained, unfolding within walls that were never meant to witness violence. The absence of sound becomes its own form of concealment. Neighbors continue their routines, unaware that routine itself has been severed just doors away. Afterward, the silence deepens. It is no longer the silence of early morning or winter calm. It is the silence of finality, of lives abruptly ended without explanation. The house absorbs this silence fully, holding it long after those inside are gone. Outside, the world resumes. Cars pass. Hours advance. The neighborhood returns to motion without understanding what has been left behind. The delay between event and recognition stretches, allowing the gap between appearance and reality to widen further. Recognition, when it comes, does not arrive gently. It arrives as shock layered over disbelief, as the sudden collapse of assumption. The image of stability shatters instantly, replaced by questions that have no immediate answers. How something so contained could occur here, how it could remain hidden until it was irrevocable. The story begins to move outward, from the house to the street, from the family to the community, from the specific to the unsettlingly familiar. Each expansion reveals not clarity but complexity. Patterns that once felt protective now appear ambiguous. Silence, once interpreted as peace, takes on a different weight. As the narrative unfolds, it becomes clear that the crime did not emerge from nowhere. It grew within conditions that felt ordinary, even virtuous: discipline, endurance, control. These qualities, praised and reinforced, became tools for concealment when unexamined. The truth advances slowly, not through voices or declarations, but through reconstruction, through the careful alignment of what is missing with what remains, through the recognition that what appears stable can conceal fracture for longer than anyone expects. The house remains at the center of this recognition. It stands unchanged, bearing no external sign of what occurred within. Its ordinariness becomes part of the story, emphasizing how thoroughly violence can be absorbed by familiarity. This absorption unsettles because it resists explanation. It forces attention away from spectacle and toward process, away from the act itself and toward the conditions that allowed it to occur without interruption. Those conditions extend beyond this family. They exist wherever silence is mistaken for strength, wherever endurance replaces engagement, wherever stability is valued more than truth. The story does not accuse these conditions outright. It observes them, tracing how they converged here with devastating consequence. As the weight of what occurred settles, questions linger without resolution. Not questions that can be answered by fact alone, but questions about how well anyone truly knows the spaces they inhabit, the people they live alongside, the quiet negotiations that shape daily life long before their outcomes become visible. These questions do not demand immediate answers. They remain suspended, shaping perception rather than action. They follow the story as it continues to unfold, moving slowly through layers of understanding, refusing to resolve into certainty. The house remains silent. The street returns to routine. And beneath the surface of ordinary life, the narrative continues to gather depth, waiting to reveal how something so devastating could emerge from a place that looked, until the very end, exactly like every other home on the block. That depth reveals itself gradually, not as revelation, but as accumulation. As attention widens beyond the house, the surrounding structures come into focus. The routines that framed daily life begin to appear less neutral, more directive. Church schedules, work obligations, community expectations, each provided shape and purpose, but each also reinforced an image that demanded consistency. Deviation from that image carried consequence, not necessarily spoken, but understood. Understanding of this kind does not require instruction. It operates through implication. It teaches what is acceptable by rewarding conformity and discouraging exposure. Within such an environment, conflict does not disappear. It relocates. It moves inward, where it can be managed privately without risking disruption of the shared exterior. The exterior mattered greatly. It functioned as a measure of success, of belonging, of moral alignment. To maintain, it required effort, discipline, and silence. Silence became a form of participation, a way of signaling stability even as strain intensified beneath it. Strain was absorbed incrementally. It did not overwhelm all at once. It presented itself as manageable pressure, something to be handled through endurance rather than confrontation. Each instance of endurance reinforced the belief that endurance was sufficient. Over time, that belief hardened into identity. Identity, once fixed, resists contradiction. To challenge it feels like self-erasure. In this story, the identity that formed valued control, order, and moral certainty. It left little room for ambiguity or vulnerability. Admitting misalignment within such a framework felt intolerable. Intolerance narrowed internal options. What could not be expressed externally was reworked internally, shaped into explanations that preserved identity while displacing responsibility. This displacement did not feel deceptive. It felt coherent, even necessary. Coherence is persuasive. It organizes experience into a narrative that feels stable, predictable, and justified. When coherence is achieved through suppression rather than engagement, it becomes brittle. It holds only as long as nothing disrupts it. Disruption was avoided at all costs, not through overt manipulation, but through quiet management. Schedules were maintained, appearances preserved. The absence of visible conflict reinforced the illusion that nothing required attention. In this way, avoidance became invisible, indistinguishable from peace. Peace, however, was conditional. It depended on silence continuing uninterrupted. The moment silence was threatened, the internal system perceived danger. This perception intensified the need for control, pushing resolution further inward rather than outward. Resolution, when confined internally, becomes absolute. It does not negotiate. It does not accommodate competing needs. It seeks finality, an end to ambiguity. In the narrowed internal world that had formed, finality began to feel preferable to endurance. This preference did not emerge suddenly. It developed through repetition, through the quiet rehearsal of dissatisfaction without response. Each rehearsal strengthened conviction, making alternative futures feel less plausible. By the time action was taken, the internal narrative had already excluded other paths. The act itself unfolded without spectacle. There was no outward chaos to signal what was happening. The neighborhood remained unaware, insulated by the very ordinariness that had once been reassuring. The absence of interruption allowed the internal decision to be carried out without resistance. Afterward, the internal narrative dissolved. What remained was the stark reality of loss, unmediated by justification. The house, unchanged in appearance, became a container for absence. Rooms once defined by movement and sound were reduced to stillness. Stillness carried weight. It pressed into spaces, altering their meaning. Objects ceased to be functional and became evidentiary. Time ceased to flow naturally and began to mark itself through absence. Beyond the house, the community struggled to reconcile what had occurred with what had been believed. The gap between perception and reality felt too wide to bridge easily. Familiar faces, familiar rituals, familiar assurances, all were re-examined through the lens of what had been hidden. This re-examination did not yield clarity. It yielded uncertainty. A recognition that stability can be convincing without being true. That proximity does not guarantee understanding. That silence can conceal as much as it can comfort. As the story continues to unfold, its focus shifts again. Away from the immediate aftermath and toward the longer process of reckoning. Not a reckoning that offers resolution, but one that reshapes awareness. It influences how people interpret calm, how they respond to strain, how they value engagement over endurance. These influences are subtle. They do not announce themselves as lessons learned. They operate quietly, altering perception rather than behavior. They linger in moments of hesitation, when speaking feels risky and waiting feels safer. In those moments, the narrative remains present, not as memory alone, but as context, as a reminder that what appears stable can fracture without warning, that what is endured in silence does not dissipate on its own. The house stands unchanged. The street resumes its rhythm. And beneath the surface of ordinary life, the story continues to deepen, revealing how devastation can emerge not from chaos, but from control left unexamined, from silence maintained too long, from the slow narrowing of possibility that occurs long before anyone believes a choice has been made. That narrowing left little room for interruption once it had taken hold. What might once have been experienced as hesitation or doubt had been absorbed into the internal logic, reframed as obstacles already overcome. The longer this logic operated without challenge, the more it came to resemble inevitability. It was no longer perceived as a set of choices, but as a single path unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Inevitability is a powerful illusion. It removes the burden of deliberation. It quiets the discomfort of uncertainty. It allows action to proceed without the friction of conscience, not because conscience has vanished, but because it has been redirected. Responsibility is no longer experienced as relational. It becomes abstract, displaced into the future or dissolved into justification. Justification does not arrive fully formed. It is constructed gradually, piece by piece, through selective attention and repetition. Each internal rehearsal strengthens conviction, smoothing over inconsistencies until the narrative feels seamless. What remains unseen is the cost of this seam, how much has been excluded to preserve it. Exclusion reshapes perception. It reduces others to symbols within the internal story, stripping them of complexity. Needs become demands. Presence becomes pressure. In this reframed world, relief appears attainable only through removal rather than repair. Repair would have required exposure. Exposure of strain. Exposure of failure. Exposure of vulnerability within an identity that prized certainty and control. The risk of that exposure felt greater than the risk of finality, a calculation that reveals how deeply misalignment had taken root. When finality arrived, it did not bring relief. It brought stillness so complete it erased movement itself. The imagined future dissolved instantly, replaced by a present defined entirely by consequence. The internal narrative, once so persuasive, could no longer function in the face of reality it could not contain. Reality asserted itself without commentary. There were no explanations offered, no opportunities for revision. What remained was the physical fact of absence and the irreversible knowledge of how it came to be. The house, unchanged in structure, became a witness to this assertion, holding what could not be undone. Beyond its walls, understanding spread unevenly. Shock gave way to disbelief, disbelief to confusion. The community struggled not only with what had happened, but with what it suggested, that the signs they relied upon to assess safety had failed them. Familiar markers of stability no longer offered reassurance. This failure unsettled deeply held assumptions. It challenged the belief that danger announces itself clearly, that moral collapse is always accompanied by visible disorder. The story insisted otherwise, revealing how thoroughly violence can be absorbed by routine when routine is allowed to replace engagement. Engagement, when absent, leaves systems vulnerable, not to sudden disruption, but to gradual distortion. The family system at the center of this narrative did not collapse under pressure. It hardened, losing flexibility while preserving form. By the time the collapse was visible, it was already complete. The aftermath extended far beyond the immediate loss. It reshaped how trust was granted, how silence was interpreted, how endurance was valued. Conversations changed tone. Certainty softened into caution. The story did not instruct this shift. It imposed it through presence alone. Presence that lingered in ordinary moments, in the pause before assuming everything was fine, in the discomfort of recognizing that calm can be curated, in the awareness that stability requires more than consistency. It requires responsiveness. Responsiveness demands attention. Attention to what feels misaligned. Attention to what is endured rather than addressed. Attention to the quiet accumulation of dissatisfaction that does not resolve itself simply by being tolerated. As time moved forward, these attentions did not fade. They integrated into perception, shaping how people navigated their own lives. Not through fear, but through recognition. recognition that futures are not forged in dramatic moments alone, but assembled quietly from days that feel unremarkable. The story remained active in those days. It surfaced when silence felt heavy rather than peaceful, when control felt brittle rather than reassuring, when endurance felt less like strength and more like erosion. It did not offer answers in those moments. It offered context. It reminded without accusing. It lingered without demanding resolution. The house still stood. The street still moved. And beneath the familiar patterns of daily life, the narrative continued its slow unfolding. Attentive to the spaces where certainty once lived, where control replaced connection, and where the cost of silence revealed itself only after silence had already shaped the outcome beyond return. It observed both, recognizing that uncertainty invites divergence rather than clarity. What it made impossible was complacency. The assumption that stability could be taken for granted no longer held. As time passed, the case receded from headlines, but it did not recede from memory. It lingered in the spaces where order was valued most, where silence was praised most highly, where endurance was expected without inquiry. It lingered as a quiet pressure, encouraging reflection even when reflection felt inconvenient. In ordinary homes, ordinary mornings continued. Doors opened. Cars started. Schedules resumed. Life, relentless in its forward motion, absorbed the shock and moved on. Yet beneath that motion, the narrative continued to unfold, patient, unresolved, attentive to the quiet places where control replaces connection, where silence substitutes for engagement, and where the future is being shaped invisibly, long before anyone believes a boundary has been crossed. That invisibility is what allows the narrative to keep moving long after attention drifts elsewhere. It moves through routines that appear restored, through calendars that refill, through conversations that resume their ordinary cadence. Life does not pause indefinitely for understanding. It adapts, carrying forward what it can and leaving the rest suspended. Yet suspension is not erasure. What remains unexamined continues to exert influence. Influence often manifests as restraint. People become careful with certainty, hesitant to declare anything settled. The confidence that once accompanied declarations of stability softens. Assurance is offered more cautiously, tempered by the recognition that surfaces can mislead. This caution does not dominate life. It shadows it. Shadow does not obscure completely. It alters contrast. It deepens awareness of edges, of transitions between light and dark. In the context of this story, shadow draws attention to the moments where alignment might falter, where discipline might harden into control, where silence might drift from peace into concealment. Concealment is rarely intentional at first. It begins as protection, of image, of routine, of faith in order. Protection, however, can become enclosure. When enclosure tightens, it restricts movement, limiting what can be acknowledged without collapse. The internal world adapts to this restriction, finding coherence within narrowing bounds, Boundaries that once felt supportive become confining. The difference is difficult to perceive while inside them. The mind adjusts, normalizing constraint as necessity. In the Coleman narrative, this adjustment occurred alongside visible adherence to structure, reinforcing the belief that discipline was sufficient. Sufficiency delayed intervention. It reassured observers and reinforced internal conviction. Each day without disruption strengthened the impression that nothing was fundamentally wrong. The absence of visible crisis was interpreted as confirmation rather than coincidence. Coincidence has a way of ending abruptly. When it does, it leaves behind the stark realization that what was taken for stability was merely continuity. Continuity without examination proved inadequate as protection. This realization rippled outward, unsettling confidence in familiar indicators of safety. Indicators were reconsidered. Silence was no longer read automatically as composure. Control was no longer equated uncritically with responsibility. Endurance was no longer praised without regard for cost. These shifts did not occur through instruction, but through exposure to consequence. Consequence teaches without speaking. It imposes understanding through absence, through irreversibility. In this case, it forced recognition that values can interact in destructive ways when taken to extremes or left unbalanced. Faith, discipline, and order, each valued, combined here with silence to produce catastrophe. This combination was not inevitable. It was contingent on conditions that unfolded over time. Conditions that felt manageable. Conditions that rewarded postponement. Conditions that discouraged interruption. The story's power lies in tracing these conditions without reducing them to blame. Blame simplifies. It isolates cause within an individual and allows systems to remain unquestioned. The narrative resists this simplification, insisting on a broader lens that includes environment, expectation, and the quiet reinforcement of silence. Silence, once again, emerges as central. Not as absence of sound, but as absence of exchange. An absence that allowed internal narratives to grow without challenge. An absence that transformed endurance into isolation. An absence that went unnoticed because it resembled peace. Peace is difficult to interrogate while it appears intact. Questioning peace feels disruptive, ungrateful. In communities that prize harmony, the cost of questioning can feel higher than the cost of waiting. The Coleman story exposes the risk embedded in this calculation. Risk does not announce itself clearly. It accumulates. It settles into patterns that feel normal. By the time it becomes visible, it has already reshaped possibility. This delayed visibility is what makes prevention feel elusive and aftermath feel overwhelming. Overwhelming not only in grief, but in implication. The implications extend beyond one household, one street, one community. They touch on how societies understand strength, how they reward control, how they interpret silence. These implications do not demand consensus. They invite reflection. Reflection is uneven. Some engage deeply, examining their own assumptions about stability and endurance. Others retreat into structure, seeking reassurance in stricter order. Both responses coexist, shaped by temperament and experience. The story accommodates this divergence without resolving it. Resolution would suggest closure. Instead, the narrative remains open, continuing to shape understanding through its presence rather than its conclusions. It exists as a reference point, not always conscious, but influential when similar conditions arise. Conditions arise quietly. In households where schedules tighten and patience wears thin. In communities where image is carefully maintained. In environments where speaking feels riskier than waiting. The story does not claim that these conditions will lead to harm. It reveals that they can. This revelation does not paralyze. It sensitizes. It sharpens awareness of the balance between discipline and flexibility, between silence and engagement. It encourages attention to the cost of endurance when endurance becomes identity. Identity, when built solely on control, leaves little room for adaptation. Adaptation requires acknowledgement of strain. It requires interruption of routine in service of alignment. The absence of interruption interruption is one of the story's most enduring observations. As time continues to pass, the events themselves recede further into history. Yet the patterns they illuminate remain present, recurring in different forms in different places. The narrative persists not because it is retold constantly, but because its implications remain relevant wherever ordinary life depends too heavily on silence to sustain itself. The house remains a structure. The neighborhood continues its rhythm. Life proceeds. And beneath that progression, the story continues its slow movement, quiet, unresolved, attentive to the unseen dynamics that shape outcomes long before anyone believes a line has been crossed, waiting in the spaces where stability is assumed, silence is praised, and the cost of endurance has not yet been counted. That counting, when it finally begins, does not follow a ledger. There is no clear accounting of when endurance becomes excess, when control shifts into confinement, when silence stops protecting and starts erasing. These thresholds are crossed gradually, without ceremony. The story shows how easily they are mistaken for virtues while they are already doing harm. Harm here was not dramatic in its formation. It did not erupt from chaos or neglect. It developed within structure, within intention, within a framework that prized order and moral certainty. This is what makes it so difficult to reconcile. The environment that was meant to prevent collapse became the medium through which collapse was allowed to mature unseen. Maturity in this context is deceptive. It suggests growth, strength, reliability. Yet what matured internally was not resilience, but rigidity. The internal narrative grew increasingly resistant to complexity, less tolerant of contradiction, more invested in preserving a singular interpretation of reality. That interpretation relied heavily on control. Control over routine, control over perception, control over the image presented to the world. When control becomes central to identity, any threat to it feels existential. The internal response to threat is no longer proportional, it is absolute. Absoluteness eliminates nuance. It replaces negotiation with conclusion, engagement with execution. Within this narrowed frame, alternatives that require exposure or compromise disappear. What remains feels clean, decisive, internally justified. This justification was never tested externally. The conditions that might have introduced friction, honest confrontation, shared vulnerability, disruption of routine, were consistently avoided. Avoidance preserved the surface, but it also insulated the internal logic from challenge. Challenge is necessary for correction. Without it, belief systems drift. They reorganize around themselves, drawing strength from repetition rather than from truth. The story traces this drift not through overt signs, but through absence of dialogue, absence of interruption, absence of shared recalibration. Recalibration is uncomfortable work. It requires acknowledging that what has been relied upon may no longer be sufficient. It asks for humility where certainty has been rewarded. In environments that prize discipline and moral clarity, recalibration can feel like failure. Failure was not tolerated here. It was reinterpreted, absorbed, reframed. The internal narrative adjusted to preserve identity at all costs. In doing so, it sacrificed flexibility, narrowing the range of acceptable outcomes until finality felt preferable to exposure. Finality arrived quietly. There was no outward chaos to signal its approach. The house contained it. The street remained unaware. The world outside continued its rhythm, indifferent to the irrevocable transformation taking place within walls built to protect life. Afterward, the contrast was stark. The same ordinariness that had concealed the fracture now underscored its severity. Nothing about the exterior explained the absence inside. This disconnect intensified the sense of disbelief, forcing recognition that appearance alone offers no guarantee of safety. Safety, reconsidered, became less about structure and more about responsiveness. The tragedy shifted attention toward the importance of adaptability, of the ability to notice when systems that once worked are no longer aligned with lived reality. This shift did not produce certainty. It produced caution. Caution reshaped interaction. People listened more carefully. They hesitated before assuming. They questioned the meaning of calm, the cost of endurance, the implications of silence. These questions did not dominate daily life, but they lingered, influencing perception at the edges. At the edges is where the story lives now. Not in constant retelling, but in the way it surfaces during moments of strain, when control feels brittle and routine feels heavy. It emerges when speaking feels risky, when waiting feels safer, when endurance is praised without inquiry. In those moments, the narrative does not instruct. It observes. It holds space for uncertainty, reminding without accusation that what is managed privately does not disappear, that what is contained too tightly can rupture without warning. The Coleman home no longer functions as a family space. It exists as a symbol without spectacle, a reminder that devastation does not require disorder to take hold. It can grow within the very qualities meant to prevent it when those qualities are left unexamined. The community continues. Faith services resume. Schools open and close. Life moves forward with necessary momentum. Yet beneath that movement, understanding has shifted subtly, altering how people interpret strength and stability. Strength is no longer synonymous with silence. Stability is no longer assumed to be self-sustaining. Control is no longer trusted without question. These shifts do not announce themselves as transformation. They integrate quietly, shaping judgment without demanding attention. And so the story continues, not as an event frozen in time, but as an active presence moving alongside ordinary life, attentive to the quiet places where values harden, where engagement is deferred, and where futures are shaped long before anyone believes they are at risk. That shaping often occurs in moments too small to be remembered. It happens when a question is almost asked, then set aside. When fatigue is interpreted as weakness rather than information. When control is mistaken for care and restraint for responsibility. These moments do not feel consequential while they are occurring. They feel practical, necessary. They pass unnoticed, absorbed into the fabric of daily life. Daily life is persuasive. Its repetition reassures. It suggests that continuity itself is proof of health. When nothing collapses, when nothing erupts, it becomes easy to believe that everything is holding. The story unsettles precisely because it reveals how much can be wrong while everything appears intact. Intactness is visual. It satisfies the eye and calms the mind. It offers a surface that discourages inquiry. In the Coleman home, intactness was carefully maintained, reinforced by routine and reinforced again by expectation. This maintenance did not require deception in the conventional sense. It required discipline. Discipline was a value deeply embedded here. It structured time, behavior, and belief. It promised order in a world that often feels unstable. When discipline works, it brings predictability and security. When discipline becomes inflexible, it suppresses deviation rather than accommodating it. Deviation is often the first signal of misalignment. It appears as irritation, as withdrawal, as a subtle change in tone or attention. When deviation is treated as something to correct rather than something to understand, it retreats. It goes underground, where it can no longer be negotiated. Negotiation requires openness. It depends on the willingness to acknowledge competing needs and incompatible expectations. In environments where moral clarity is prized, negotiation can feel like compromise of principle. The internal world adapts accordingly, favoring resolution over dialogue. Resolution, when pursued alone, becomes insular. It reflects only the logic of the self, unchecked by relational reality. The story traces how this insularity gradually displaced shared understanding, leaving behind parallel realities that never fully intersected until the final moment. That moment did not feel climactic from the outside. There was no sound to draw attention, no visible disruption. The absence of interruption allowed the act to proceed as though the world itself were indifferent. This indifference was not cruelty, it was proximity without awareness. Awareness arrived too late. When it did, it arrived all at once, overwhelming in its totality. The ordinary collapsed into the extraordinary, leaving no space for gradual comprehension. The suddenness of this shift intensified the shock, making it difficult to reconcile what had been known with what was now undeniable. Denial lingered briefly, not as refusal of fact, but as disbelief that such fact could coexist with memory. The mind searched for error, for misinterpretation, for some alternative explanation that would preserve coherence. None arrived. Coherence had to be rebuilt differently. It could no longer rely on appearance or routine. It had to account for the possibility that silence can conceal fracture, that endurance can mask resentment, that control can obscure desperation. This rebuilding was slow, uneven, and deeply uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because it challenged long-held beliefs. Beliefs about faith as protection, about discipline as safeguard, about family as inherently safe. The story did not dismantle these beliefs entirely. It complicated them, revealing how they can interact in destructive ways when taken to extremes or left unexamined. Examination became a quiet imperative. Not a public reckoning, but a private one. Individuals reconsidered how they interpreted calm, how they valued endurance, how they responded to silence. These reconsiderations did not always lead to change. Sometimes they led only to awareness. Awareness itself carried weight. It slowed assumptions. It introduced pauses where certainty once prevailed. It allowed space for questions that had previously felt unnecessary or intrusive. These pauses did not resolve tension. They acknowledged it. Acknowledgement does not guarantee safety. The story does not promise that attention alone prevents harm. It reveals only that inattention allowed harm to mature without resistance. This distinction matters. It resists simplistic conclusions while insisting on responsibility for engagement. Engagement is relational work. It requires ongoing effort, the willingness to disrupt routine in service of alignment. It asks for discomfort before crisis, for vulnerability before collapse. In the absence of such work, systems drift toward rigidity. Rigidity, once established, resists correction. It values preservation over adaptation, certainty over inquiry. In the Coleman case, rigidity preserved form until form itself became the means of devastation. This realization altered how many understood strength. Strength began to look less like control and more like responsiveness, less like endurance and more like flexibility, less like silence and more like presence. These shifts did not replace old values, they reframed them. Reframing takes time. It unfolds across years. across ordinary days that carry the imprint of what has been learned without being dominated by it. The story becomes part of that imprint, influencing how people inhabit their lives without dictating how they must live them. It remains nearby in moments of strain. When routine tightens, when patience thins, when the impulse to endure quietly competes with the impulse to speak. In these moments, the narrative does not intrude. It waits. Waiting, once again, becomes central, not the waiting of avoidance, but the waiting of attentiveness. The kind that listens for misalignment. The kind that notices when stability feels performative rather than sustaining. The kind that recognizes that silence is not always neutral. The house remains still. The street continues its rhythm. Life, relentless and ordinary, moves forward. And within that movement, the story continues to unfold slowly, unresolved, observant, attentive to the quiet decisions that shape futures long before anyone believes a line has been crossed, holding space for the recognition that what is unseen is not inactive, and what is endured in silence continues to act. That action, silent and unseen, continues even after the event itself has passed. It acts through memory, through recalibration, through the subtle alteration of how people inhabit their own lives. The story no longer belongs solely to the house or the street where it unfolded. It has diffused outward, embedding itself in awareness rather than geography. Awareness is not static. It evolves as distance from the event grows, shaped by time and repetition. Initially, it is sharp, almost intrusive, coloring every reflection with immediacy. Later, it becomes quieter, less insistent, but no less present. It settles into the background of understanding, influencing perception without demanding attention. This influence is most evident in moments of strain, when responsibilities accumulate and patience thins, when the pressure to maintain composure outweighs the impulse to speak. In these moments, the narrative resurfaces not as fear, but as context. It reminds without accusation that endurance has limits, and that those limits matter. Limits were not acknowledged early enough here. They were interpreted as temporary obstacles, manageable through increased control and further silence. Each time a limit was approached, it was pushed back, absorbed into routine. The pushing itself became a habit, reinforcing the belief that boundaries were flexible when, in fact, they were being eroded. Erosion does not produce immediate collapse. It weakens structure incrementally, leaving the exterior intact until it can no longer support what it contains. In the Coleman home, erosion affected not walls or foundations, but relational integrity. Trust became procedural. Care became obligation. Presence became performance. Performance is convincing. It reassures observers and sustains identity. It allows life to continue without interruption, but performance without alignment requires increasing effort. Over time, that effort becomes unsustainable, even if the strain remains invisible. Invisibility delayed response. There were no outward signals demanding intervention, no visible disorder to justify disruption. everything appeared contained. This containment was interpreted as success rather than warning. Warning signs in this narrative were internal. They existed as discomfort, dissatisfaction, and resentment that had no sanctioned outlet. Without engagement, these experiences reorganized internally, shaping a worldview increasingly detached from shared reality. Detachment does not feel like separation at first. It feels like clarity, like resolve, like understanding something others do not. This feeling is seductive because it offers coherence where ambiguity has become intolerable. The internal narrative gains authority precisely because it is unchallenged. Challenge requires relationship. It depends on exchange, on friction, on the willingness to risk misunderstanding in service of alignment. When relationship becomes conditional on performance, challenge is perceived as threat. Threat activates defense. Defense narrows focus, prioritizing preservation over connection. In this narrowed state, empathy recedes, replaced by justification. The story traces how this shift occurred without overt hostility, carried forward by routine and reinforced by silence. After the irreversible occurred, defense was no longer relevant. What remained was consequence, unmediated, permanent. The internal logic that had justified action could not accommodate the reality it produced. The collapse of that logic left behind a stark absence, felt not only in physical space, but in the fabric of meaning itself. Meaning had to be reconstructed, not as explanation, but as orientation. Those affected sought ways to continue living in a world that no longer aligned with prior assumptions. This reconstruction did not restore certainty. It introduced humility. Humility acknowledged what could not be known in advance. It recognized the limits of perception, the danger of equating appearance with truth. This recognition altered how trust was extended, how calm was interpreted, how silence was evaluated. Evaluation became more nuanced. Silence was no longer neutral by default. It invited inquiry rather than reassurance. Control was no longer admired without question. Endurance was no longer praised in isolation from its cost. These shifts did not eradicate risk. They did not guarantee safety. They simply restored attention to processes that had previously gone unexamined. Attention, while imperfect, creates opportunity for engagement where avoidance once prevailed. Engagement is not dramatic. It does not announce itself as prevention. It manifests in small acts of interruption, asking, listening, acknowledging strain before it hardens. These acts feel minor in the moment. Their absence, however, can be profound. The story lingers in that contrast between what feels minor and what proves consequential. Between days that seem indistinguishable and outcomes that are irrevocable. It insists that significance often accumulates quietly, without spectacle. Spectacle arrived only after it was too late. By then, the house had already absorbed what it would contain forever. The neighborhood had already continued its rhythm. The world had already moved on, unaware of what had been lost behind closed doors. Closed doors are a recurring image here. They represent privacy, safety, boundary. They also represent concealment, separation, isolation. The story does not argue against doors. It asks what happens when what remains behind them is never shared. Shared reality is fragile. It depends on continual exchange, on the willingness to revise understanding together. When that exchange stops, reality fragments. Each fragment becomes coherent internally, incompatible externally. Incompatibility was not recognized until it was irreversible. The realization that shared reality had dissolved arrived too late to restore it. What followed was not correction, but mourning, not only of lives, but of assumptions about how lives are held together. Those assumptions were deeply rooted. They involved faith in order, trust in discipline, belief in moral clarity. The story does not reject these foundations. It reveals how they require balance, how they must be paired with openness, flexibility, and dialogue to remain protective. Balance was absent here. In its place stood rigidity, rewarded and reinforced until it could no longer adapt. This rigidity did not announce itself as danger. It presented as strength. Strength, reconsidered, became something else entirely. Not the ability to endure silently, but the capacity to engage honestly. Not the maintenance of appearance, but the preservation of alignment. Not control, but responsiveness. These redefinitions did not arrive fully formed. They emerged slowly, through reflection and discomfort, through the recognition that what had been admired might also have concealed risk. This recognition was not universal, nor was it consistent. It surfaced unevenly, shaped by proximity to loss. As time continued forward, the narrative remained, not as a warning shouted, but as a presence felt. It accompanied ordinary lives, attentive to moments when silence tempted, when control tightened, when endurance felt heavy. It waited in those moments, not to instruct, not to accuse, but to remind that what is left unexamined does not remain still, that what is managed in isolation does not cease to act, and that futures are shaped quietly, long before anyone believes a boundary has been crossed. That quiet shaping remains difficult to interrupt because it feels so ordinary while it is happening. Ordinariness is persuasive. It dulls urgency. It convinces people that what they are experiencing is temporary, manageable, undeserving of attention. In this story, ordinariness functioned as camouflage, allowing internal deterioration to proceed beneath a surface that appeared stable and disciplined. Discipline, when reinforced externally, rarely invites scrutiny. It is praised for its outcomes rather than examined for its costs. Schedules are kept. Responsibilities are fulfilled. Appearances remain intact. These visible successes discourage inquiry into the internal strain required to maintain them. The effort remains invisible, even to the one expending it. Invisibility alters self-perception. When effort is not acknowledged, it is internalized as expectation. What was once chosen becomes obligatory. Over time, obligation begins to feel imposed rather than embraced. This shift is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it changes how endurance is experienced. Endurance without recognition breeds resentment. Resentment, when unexpressed, reorganizes internal priorities. It reframes sacrifice as injustice, patience as loss. The internal narrative begins to emphasize imbalance, constructing explanations that justify withdrawal or escape. These explanations do not emerge as hostility. They emerge as logic. Logic can be dangerous when it is isolated. It convinces without negotiating. It clarifies without considering impact. In isolation, logic prioritizes internal consistency over relational truth. The story shows how such logic can harden gradually, narrowing perception until alternatives disappear. Alternatives rarely vanish suddenly. They fade. They become less visible, less plausible, easier to dismiss. Each dismissal strengthens the remaining path, making it feel not only preferable but necessary. This process unfolds quietly, reinforced by routine and protected by silence. Silence functions here as reinforcement. It prevents contradiction. It shields internal narratives from challenge. It allows justifications to mature without friction. Over time, silence stops feeling like restraint and starts feeling like proof that restraint is working. Working toward what, however, remains undefined. The internal world focuses increasingly on relief rather than resolution. Relief promises immediacy. It imagines an end to strain without requiring engagement. In this framing, engagement feels inefficient, even futile. Efficiency becomes the guiding principle. Complexity is reduced. Ambiguity is eliminated. The future is envisioned as a singular outcome rather than a field of possibility. This reduction feels stabilizing internally, even as it destabilizes everything else. By the time the act occurred, the internal narrative had already concluded. What followed was not deliberation, but execution. The absence of visible disruption allowed execution to proceed uninterrupted, contained within walls that absorbed it without resistance. After containment came exposure. Exposure did not arrive gradually. It arrived all at once, overwhelming in its clarity. The internal logic that had justified action dissolved instantly, leaving behind a reality that could not be explained away. Reality did not argue. It imposed itself through absence, through irreversibility, through the sudden collapse of assumptions. The house, unchanged in form, became uninhabitable in meaning. Its rooms no longer supported life as it had been known. Beyond the house, meaning fractured as well. The community struggled to reconcile memory with fact, trust with betrayal, faith in order with evidence of its failure. This struggle did not produce resolution. It produced reflection. Reflection did not follow a single direction. Some sought reassurance in structure, tightening routines, reinforcing boundaries. Others questioned the very foundations that had once felt secure. Both responses emerged from the same shock, shaped by different needs. The story accommodates both without judgment. It observes how people respond when certainty fails, how they seek stability in different forms. What it does not allow is a return to unexamined assumption. Assumption had proven insufficient. It had allowed silence to masquerade as peace, control to masquerade as care, endurance to masquerade as strength. The collapse of these masquerades reshaped perception long after the event itself receded. As years passed, the details of the case softened at the edges. Facts remained, but their emotional immediacy dulled. What endured was atmosphere, the sense that something essential had been revealed about how harm can develop without chaos, how devastation can grow within order. This atmosphere continued to influence awareness. It surfaced in moments of strain, when the pressure to maintain composure conflicted with the need for honesty. It appeared when silence felt heavy rather than restful, when routine felt oppressive rather than supportive. In these moments, the narrative did not intrude. It accompanied. It reminded without demanding attention that what feels manageable today may be accumulating unseen, that endurance has limits even when it is praised, that control requires flexibility to remain humane. Flexibility had been absent here. Its absence was not dramatic. It was normalized. It was rewarded. Only in its absence did its necessity become clear. Necessity, once recognized, altered values quietly. Strength began to include vulnerability. Responsibility began to include responsiveness. Stability began to require engagement. These shifts did not replace existing beliefs, they complicated them. Complication slowed certainty. It introduced pauses into judgments that once felt automatic. It encouraged listening where assumptions had sufficed. It did not eliminate risk, but it reintroduced awareness as a counterbalance to routine. Routine continued. Homes filled, streets emptied and refilled. Life moved forward with persistent momentum. The world did not stop for reflection, but reflection continued nonetheless, woven into perception. The story remained part of that weave, not as a caution announced, but as an undercurrent felt. It moved alongside ordinary days, attentive to the quiet negotiations that shape direction long before consequences appear. It waited where silence is chosen because speaking feels inconvenient. It waited where control tightens because uncertainty feels threatening. It waited where endurance is praised without inquiry. And it continued to remind, without words or judgment, that what is left unexamined does not remain inert, that what is carried in isolation continues to shape outcome, and that futures are assembled quietly, one ordinary day at a time, long before anyone believes the ordinary has become dangerous. That ordinariness remains the most unsettling element of all. It persists because it feels familiar, because it mirrors the rhythms most people recognize as their own. Morning routines, evening obligations, the quiet satisfaction of tasks completed and appearances maintained. These rhythms offer reassurance precisely because they are shared. They suggest that what is common must also be safe. Safety in this story was inferred rather than examined. It was built from repetition and reinforced by expectation. When days resemble one another closely enough, deviation becomes difficult to detect. Subtle shifts register as fatigue, as stress, as temporary imbalance. They are absorbed into the flow of routine without interruption. Interruption carries cost. It demands attention, time, and vulnerability. It risks destabilizing systems that appear to function. In environments where discipline and composure are prized, interruption can feel irresponsible, even disloyal. The story traces how this reluctance to interrupt allowed internal pressures to consolidate unchecked. Unchecked pressure does not explode immediately. It compacts. It concentrates. Over time, it reshapes perception, narrowing how the future is imagined. Options that once existed fade into improbability. What remains begins to feel not only preferable, but inevitable. Inevitability, once internalized, alters moral orientation. Choices are no longer weighed, they are justified in advance. Impact recedes from consideration, replaced by the promise of resolution. This shift does not feel cruel from within. It feels necessary. Necessity is convincing because it quiets doubt. It reframes harm as consequence rather than choice. It transforms action into outcome, blurring responsibility. The story shows how easily this reframing can occur when internal narratives operate without relational challenge. Relational challenge requires friction. It requires disagreement, misalignment, and the tolerance of discomfort. In settings that emphasize harmony and moral certainty, friction is often avoided in favor of cohesion. Yet cohesion without friction can conceal divergence until it becomes irreconcilable. Irreconcilability arrived here without warning. From the outside, nothing suggested imminent collapse. The house stood. The street remained calm. The world continued its rhythm. Inside, however, alignment had already dissolved, replaced by parallel realities that no longer intersected. When intersection occurred, it was final. The absence that followed was total, not only of life, but of continuity. What had been assumed to endure ceased instantly. The permanence of this cessation resisted narrative integration, leaving behind questions that could not be resolved through explanation alone. Explanation addresses sequence, not meaning. Meaning had to be reconstructed slowly, through reflection rather than resolution. This reconstruction did not restore confidence. It introduced humility, a recognition that certainty is often granted too easily, that appearances can mislead, that silence is not inherently benign. This humility altered how people engaged with their own lives. It did not eliminate routine or discipline. It complicated them. It introduced an awareness of cost, a sensitivity to strain, a willingness to question endurance when endurance began to feel corrosive. Corrosion is gradual. It does not announce itself until damage is advanced. The story insists on this point repeatedly, not through repetition of facts, but through atmosphere. Through the lingering sense that what went unnoticed mattered as much as what was seen. Seen elements. The house, The neighborhood, the structures of daily life, remained deceptively unchanged. What changed was interpretation. Stability was no longer accepted at face value. Control was no longer admired without examination. Silence was no longer automatically equated with peace. These interpretive shifts did not spread evenly. Some resisted them, seeking reassurance in stricter adherence to order. Others embraced uncertainty, allowing it to inform engagement. Both responses reflect the difficulty of living without the comfort of assumption. Assumption had once provided ease. It reduced cognitive load, allowed trust to function without constant verification. The loss of that ease introduced friction into daily life. People had to pay closer attention, to tolerate ambiguity, to accept that knowing someone well is an ongoing process rather than a completed task. This acceptance is demanding. It asks for sustained presence, for dialogue that may disrupt harmony, for acknowledgement of strain before it hardens. The story does not suggest that such demands guarantee safety. It reveals only that their absence allowed harm to mature unseen. Unseen processes remain the narrative's core concern. They are difficult to dramatize because they lack spectacle. They unfold quietly within ordinary days that feel indistinguishable from one another, yet they shape outcomes decisively. The story's persistence lies in its attention to these processes. It does not require constant retelling to remain relevant. It resides in awareness, surfacing when familiar conditions arise, when silence is chosen over engagement, when control tightens in response to uncertainty, when endurance is praised without inquiry. In those moments, the narrative is present, not as warning or prescription, but as context. As a reminder that what feels manageable today may be accumulating unseen, that stability requires maintenance beyond appearance, and that alignment cannot be assumed indefinitely. The house remains a structure. The street continues its rhythm. Life proceeds as it always does. And beneath that progression, the story continues to move quietly, unfinished, observant, accompanying ordinary lives where decisions are deferred, questions are postponed, and futures take shape gradually, long before anyone believes that the ordinary has begun to fracture. That fracture, when it finally becomes visible, is rarely traced back to a single moment. It is understood, instead, as a series of permissions granted quietly over time. Permission to delay difficult conversations. Permission to absorb strain without naming it. Permission to equate order with health and silence with virtue. Each permission feels minor, almost responsible. Together, they construct an environment where misalignment can deepen without resistance. Resistance requires disruption. Disruption challenges rhythm, and rhythm is comforting. Rhythm tells people where they are and what is expected of them. It creates a sense of belonging that does not demand constant negotiation. In the Coleman home, rhythm was precise, predictable, reinforced by belief and obligation. It offered clarity, but it also discouraged deviation. Deviation was not absent. It was simply managed. Feelings that did not fit the established cadence were contained privately, reframed as personal shortcomings or temporary fatigue. The effort to contain them became part of daily life, woven into routines so thoroughly that it no longer felt exceptional. Exceptional moments are easier to notice. They draw attention by breaking pattern. What occurred here did the opposite. It followed pattern closely enough to remain invisible. The story reveals how danger can hide within consistency, how predictability can provide cover rather than protection. Protection is often imagined as external. Locks, schedules, roles, rules. These are tangible, reassuring. They suggest that safety can be engineered through structure alone. The narrative dismantles this assumption gently, showing how structure without responsiveness can become brittle. Brittleness does not announce itself loudly. It manifests as rigidity, as reduced tolerance for ambiguity, as an insistence that existing systems are sufficient. When brittleness sets in, adaptation feels threatening. The impulse becomes preservation at all costs. Preservation, when prioritized above engagement, isolates. It narrows attention to maintenance rather than meaning. Relationships are sustained procedurally, through obligation rather than curiosity. The internal world, deprived of exchange, begins to rely increasingly on self-justifying narratives. These narratives feel coherent. They organize experience efficiently, eliminating contradictions that create discomfort. Over time, coherence becomes more important than truth. The internal logic is protected from challenge by silence, reinforced by routine. Routine, again, becomes central. It reassures observers and stabilizes identity. It allows life to continue uninterrupted. The absence of visible disruption is interpreted as success. This interpretation persists until it is contradicted irrevocably. Contradiction arrived here without prelude. It shattered the illusion that continuity equaled safety. The abruptness of this shattering intensified the shock, making it difficult to reconcile the familiar with the catastrophic. The same routines that once comforted now felt complicit. Complicity is unsettling because it lacks intent. It suggests that harm can occur without malice, through processes that are socially rewarded. Discipline, control, endurance. These qualities, valued and reinforced, became instruments of concealment when left unexamined. Examination requires space. Space to question assumptions, to tolerate uncertainty, to admit strain. In environments that prize moral clarity and composure, such space is limited. The story traces how this limitation contributed to the narrowing of possibility. Narrowing does not feel dangerous while it is happening. It feels clarifying. It reduces complexity, making decisions seem more manageable. The cost of this reduction remains invisible until alternatives have disappeared entirely. After disappearance comes finality. Finality is absolute. It does not negotiate. It leaves no room for revision. The recognition of finality arrives too late to alter course, but not too late to reshape understanding. Understanding shifted slowly. It did not resolve grief or restore trust. It altered how people interpreted their own lives, how they assessed calm, how they valued endurance, how they responded to silence. Silence became suspect but not condemned. It was reconsidered, evaluated, weighed against context. The story did not demand that silence be broken always, only that it be chosen consciously rather than by default. Default choices are powerful. They operate without awareness, shaping outcomes invisibly. The narrative's enduring influence lies in making these defaults visible, inviting reflection where habit once sufficed. Reflection does not guarantee action. Often it produces only hesitation, a pause where certainty once prevailed. Yet even this pause matters. It interrupts the automatic progression from strain to endurance to isolation. Isolation was a defining condition here. It existed alongside proximity, within shared spaces and shared schedules. It was maintained by performance and reinforced by expectation. Its presence was not obvious until connection had already dissolved. Dissolution does not reverse easily. Once shared reality fragments, rebuilding requires effort and humility. In this case, rebuilding could not occur. What remained was the task of living with absence and implication. Implication extended outward. It touched how communities understood faith, responsibility, and strength. It complicated narratives that equated moral discipline with safety. It introduced the possibility that unquestioned virtue can conceal harm. This possibility did not settle comfortably. It resisted integration into simple frameworks. It lingered as discomfort, as uncertainty, as the recognition that vigilance must include attention to the unseen. Attention, in this sense, is not suspicion. It is presence. It is the willingness to notice drift, to inquire before rupture, to engage before finality. The story does not claim that such attention would have prevented what occurred. It reveals only that its absence allowed the process to continue uninterrupted. Uninterrupted processes shape outcomes quietly. They do not announce themselves as turning points. They unfold within days that feel ordinary, within routines that feel necessary, within silences that feel prudent. The narrative remains attuned to these spaces. It waits where certainty feels comforting, where control feels stabilizing, where endurance feels admirable. It observes how easily these feelings can slide into rigidity when left unexamined. The house remains still. The street continues its rhythm. Life proceeds, carrying forward memory without always naming it. And beneath that movement, the story continues, slow, unresolved, attentive to the quiet permissions granted each day, to the moments when engagement is deferred, to the futures being assembled invisibly within the ordinary, long before anyone believes that the ordinary has begun to fail. That invisibility is sustained by familiarity. Familiarity reassures precisely because it resists scrutiny. It allows people to move through days without reassessing foundations, without questioning whether what has always been present remains supportive. In the environment surrounding this story, familiarity was not merely comforting, it was authoritative. It instructed without speaking, teaching what to expect and how to behave. Expectation shaped perception. It filtered what was noticed and what was dismissed. Signs that did not fit the expected narrative were softened, rationalized, or absorbed into routine. Fatigue was interpreted as stress. Distance was interpreted as focus. Silence was interpreted as composure. Each interpretation reinforced the belief that nothing required intervention. Intervention implies disruption. It carries the risk of exposing instability, of challenging identity, of unsettling systems that appear to function. In communities where order and moral clarity are prized, disruption can feel like failure. The pressure to avoid it grows stronger as stakes rise. Stakes here were not immediately visible. They accumulated slowly, beneath the surface of daily life. Responsibilities layered upon one another. Expectations hardened. The internal world adapted by narrowing focus, by prioritizing control as the primary means of survival. Control offered predictability. It reduced uncertainty and provided a sense of mastery. Yet predictability came at a cost. It limited flexibility, discouraging adaptation when conditions changed. When control became central to identity, deviation felt threatening rather than informative. Threat perception intensified isolation. The internal narrative turned inward, seeking coherence without external input. This inward turn did not feel like withdrawal. It felt like clarity, like resolve, like understanding what others could not see. This sense of exclusive understanding is powerful. It reinforces conviction and diminishes doubt. Without challenge, it allows internal logic to operate unchecked, prioritizing resolution over relationship. The story traces how this unchecked logic matured quietly, protected by routine and reinforced by silence. Routine remained intact until it could not. The same patterns that had concealed fracture now highlighted absence. The contrast between what had been assumed and what had occurred was too stark to reconcile easily. Familiar spaces became charged with meaning they were never meant to hold. Meaning, once altered, does not revert. The house no longer functioned as a home. It became a container for loss, for questions without resolution, for the weight of what had been hidden. Its ordinariness intensified the shock, underscoring how thoroughly devastation can be absorbed by familiarity. Beyond the house, understanding fractured. The community grappled not only with grief, but with implication. The realization that what had appeared stable could conceal such violence unsettled deeply held beliefs. Trust in visible markers of safety weakened, replaced by uncertainty that resisted simplification. Simplification would have offered relief. It would have isolated cause within a single failure or flaw. The narrative refused that relief. It insisted on complexity, on the convergence of silence, control, expectation, and endurance. It suggested that no single factor could explain what occurred, only the interaction between them. Interaction matters. Values that are protective in balance can become destructive in excess. Discipline without flexibility. Faith without dialogue. Endurance without acknowledgement. Each of these shifts the internal environment subtly, altering how strain is processed. Strain, when unprocessed, accumulates. It does not dissipate on its own. It reshapes internal priorities, reframing sacrifice as injustice and patience as deprivation. Without relational engagement, these reframings harden into conviction. Conviction narrowed possibility. By the time action occurred, alternatives had already been eliminated internally. The path forward appeared singular not because it was imposed, but because all others had been dismissed. This narrowing unfolded without urgency, carried forward by habit rather than impulse. Habit is powerful. It sustains behavior without requiring reflection. It allows people to function efficiently while remaining disconnected from the meaning of their actions. In this story, habit maintained appearance while eroding connection. Connection requires maintenance. It depends on exchange, on the willingness to tolerate discomfort, on the courage to interrupt routine in service of alignment. The absence of such maintenance allowed isolation to deepen within proximity, leaving shared reality fragmented. Fragmentation became evident only after it was irreversible. The suddenness of that realization intensified the trauma, leaving little room for gradual comprehension. The community was forced to reconcile memory with fact, trust with betrayal, faith in order with evidence of its failure. This reconciliation did not conclude neatly. It unfolded unevenly, producing reflection rather than resolution. People reconsidered how they interpreted calm, how they valued endurance, how they responded to silence. These reconsiderations did not always lead to change, but they altered awareness. Awareness slowed certainty. It introduced hesitation where confidence once prevailed. It made room for questions that had previously felt unnecessary. This slowing did not halt life. It reshaped how life was navigated. Navigation became more attentive. People listened differently. They noticed when routines felt strained rather than sustaining. They recognized that strength could include vulnerability, that responsibility could include responsiveness. These shifts were subtle. They did not announce themselves as lessons learned. They integrated quietly into perception, influencing decisions at the margins. The story continued to live in those margins, shaping understanding without demanding attention. Time continued forward. Details softened. The immediacy of shock faded. What remained was atmosphere, a persistent sense that something essential had been revealed about how harm can develop within order, how devastation can grow without chaos. This atmosphere accompanied ordinary life. It surfaced in moments of strain, when silence felt heavy, when control felt brittle, when endurance felt corrosive. In those moments, the narrative was present, not as warning or prescription, but as context. Context that reminded without accusing, that what is left unexamined does not remain inert. that what is managed in isolation continues to act, that futures are assembled quietly, within ordinary days that feel indistinguishable from one another, long before anyone believes that the ordinary has begun to fracture. That fracture, once acknowledged, does not close. It widens perception rather than resolving it. People begin to recognize how easily stability can be mistaken for safety, how consistency can substitute for connection. This recognition does not arrive as revelation. It settles slowly, altering the way ordinary scenes are interpreted. A quiet evening no longer reads as neutral. A disciplined routine no longer guarantees alignment. Familiarity becomes something to be understood, not trusted outright. Understanding demands effort. It requires returning attention to spaces that were previously ignored because they seemed unproblematic. Kitchens where schedules are coordinated. Living rooms where silence stretches unbroken. Cars where days are planned efficiently, but interior lives remain unspoken. These spaces do not announce tension. They absorb it. Absorption allows strain to persist without confrontation. It permits imbalance to deepen while preserving surface harmony. In the environment surrounding this story, absorption was reinforced by expectation. To endure quietly was framed as responsibility. To question openly risked appearing ungrateful, unstable, or disloyal. Loyalty became intertwined with silence. Speaking felt like rupture. Waiting felt like virtue. This framing narrowed the range of acceptable response to strain, pushing dissatisfaction inward where it could be controlled. Control, however, is not neutral when it replaces engagement. Control organizes experience around containment. It reduces unpredictability by limiting expression. It creates a manageable internal world at the cost of relational exchange. Over time, this internal world becomes self-sustaining, drawing validation from its own coherence rather than from shared reality. Shared reality weakens without exchange. It fragments quietly, leaving behind parallel interpretations of the same life. These interpretations coexist without intersecting, giving the illusion of unity while divergence deepens. The story traces how this divergence went unnoticed because routine continued uninterrupted. Interruption is uncomfortable. It forces reconsideration of identity, of roles, of expectations that have been carefully maintained. In systems that prize order and moral certainty, interruption feels dangerous. The instinct becomes preservation rather than inquiry. Preservation protected form but sacrificed flexibility. When conditions shifted, the system could not adapt. It hardened instead, defending itself against perceived threat. This defense did not appear hostile. It appeared rational, efficient, even principled. Principle, when detached from reflection, becomes rigid. It resists nuance. It prioritizes consistency over responsiveness. In the internal narrative that developed here, principle provided justification while eliminating doubt. What remained felt inevitable rather than chosen. Inevitability erases agency. It reframes action as outcome, blurring responsibility. The story does not present this reframing as malicious. It presents it as the end result of prolonged avoidance, of decisions deferred until choice narrowed into compulsion. Compulsion did not announce itself. It emerged from habit, reinforced by silence and reward. Each day that passed without disruption strengthened the belief that endurance was sufficient. The absence of visible consequence was interpreted as confirmation. Confirmation delayed reckoning. By the time reckoning arrived, it was no longer corrective. It was absolute. The ordinary world collided with irrevocable absence, leaving no space for gradual comprehension. Comprehension followed later, unevenly. It did not restore balance or certainty. It reshaped awareness. It altered how people thought about responsibility and restraint, about faith in structure, about the difference between composure and concealment. This reshaping did not dismantle existing values. It complicated them. Discipline was no longer admired without question. Endurance was no longer praised without regard for cost. Silence was no longer equated automatically with peace. Peace, reconsidered, required engagement. It demanded dialogue rather than performance, flexibility rather than rigidity. These demands felt heavy, especially in environments accustomed to clarity and order. Yet their absence had revealed its own cost. Cost became the lens through which ordinary life was re-examined, not in a constant state of alarm, but with a subtle attentiveness. People noticed when routines felt strained, when control felt brittle, when silence felt dense rather than restful. These notices did not always lead to action. Sometimes they led only to hesitation. Hesitation mattered. It interrupted automatic progression. It created space where none had existed before. Even brief pauses altered the trajectory of internal narratives, preventing them from consolidating unchecked. Unchecked narratives had proven dangerous. They had allowed relief to eclipse responsibility, resolution to eclipse relationship. The story's enduring presence lies in making this danger visible without simplifying it. Simplification would offer closure. Closure would suggest that the lessons have been learned and the risk contained. The narrative resists this comfort. It remains open, unfinished, attentive to recurrence. Recurrence does not replicate events, it replicates conditions. Silence rewarded, control praised, endurance normalized. These conditions appear in many places, wearing different faces, speaking different languages, embedded within different beliefs. The story recognizes itself in them without accusation. Accusation would distance. Observation invites recognition. The narrative does not ask to be remembered constantly. It asks to be felt when relevance arises, when strain accumulates quietly, when stability feels assumed rather than sustained. In those moments, the story is present. Not as fear, not as instruction, as awareness. Awareness that what is unspoken continues to act, that what is contained too tightly reshapes outcome. that futures are not decided in dramatic moments alone, but assembled patiently within ordinary days, long before anyone believes that the ordinary has become dangerous. The house remains. The street continues. Life moves forward. And beneath that movement, the story remains unresolved, attentive, and waiting, present wherever silence is chosen over engagement, wherever control replaces connection, wherever endurance is praised without inquiry, quietly observing how the unseen continues to shape what comes next. That waiting is not passive. It is active in the way gravity is active, constant, unnoticed, shaping trajectory without announcing itself. It operates beneath decisions that feel practical and beneath habits that feel necessary. It influences how strain is interpreted and how relief is imagined. Over time, it teaches people what to tolerate and what to avoid. In the context of this story, waiting became a substitute for engagement, and endurance became a proxy for resolution. Resolution, however, never arrived through endurance alone. What arrived instead was compression. Pressure folded inward, contained by discipline and reinforced by expectation. Each day that passed without disruption strengthened the belief that containment was working. The absence of visible consequence became evidence of success. Success is seductive. It reassures not only the individual, but the surrounding environment. It validates the systems in place and discourages inquiry. When success is defined by outward stability, inward deterioration can proceed without challenge. Deterioration here did not resemble chaos. It resembled control. It resembled composure. It resembled a narrowing focus on obligation and outcome. These qualities were rewarded, admired, and left unquestioned. In that admiration, space for vulnerability disappeared. Vulnerability is often framed as risk. It threatens image and disrupts order. In settings where moral certainty and discipline are emphasized, vulnerability can feel dangerous. The instinct becomes concealment rather than disclosure, management rather than dialogue. Management maintains function. It keeps schedules intact and responsibilities fulfilled. It does not ask whether those responsibilities remain aligned with internal reality. Over time, this misalignment becomes normalized, treated as the cost of duty rather than as information. Information ignored does not vanish. It transforms. It reshapes internal narratives, reframing dissatisfaction as injustice and patience as deprivation. Without external correction, these narratives gain authority, constructing a logic that prioritizes relief over relationship. Relationship requires reciprocity. It demands that strain be shared before it hardens. It requires that misalignment be named while it is still negotiable. In the absence of this reciprocity, the internal world becomes increasingly insulated. Insulation protects coherence. It allows belief systems to operate without friction, reinforcing certainty and diminishing doubt. Within this insulated space, alternatives that require exposure or compromise appear increasingly implausible. The future is imagined as singular, not plural. Plurality is uncomfortable. It introduces ambiguity and requires tolerance of unresolved tension. When tolerance erodes, decisiveness feels preferable. The story traces how decisiveness emerged not from clarity, but from exhaustion, an exhaustion born of prolonged avoidance. Avoidance preserved the surface. It allowed ordinary life to continue uninterrupted. It reassured observers and sustained identity. Yet it also prevented recalibration, locking internal processes into a trajectory that could no longer adapt. Adaptation requires interruption. It asks for moments where routine is paused and assumptions are questioned. These moments are rare in systems that reward consistency. The absence of interruption allowed the internal narrative to reach its conclusion without resistance. That conclusion did not feel violent from within. It felt necessary, inevitable. The internal logic had already eliminated alternatives, framing action as the only remaining option. This framing did not arise suddenly. It was constructed patiently, reinforced by silence and routine. When action occurred, it did so within containment. There was no outward signal, no disruption to the surrounding environment. The world continued its rhythm, unaware that irreversibility had entered its midst. This indifference intensified the later shock, highlighting how completely the event had been absorbed by normalcy. Normalcy proved incapable of explaining what followed. Explanation addressed sequence but not meaning. Meaning fractured under the weight of absence, forcing those left behind to navigate a landscape where familiar markers no longer held. Markers such as discipline, faith, and order were not abandoned. They were re-examined. Their protective qualities were no longer assumed to be unconditional. Their interaction with silence and control was recognized as consequential. This recognition did not settle easily. It introduced discomfort into spaces once defined by certainty. It complicated narratives that had offered reassurance. It required living with ambiguity rather than resolving it. Ambiguity became part of daily life, not as paralysis, but as awareness. People hesitated where they once assumed. They listened where they once interpreted. They questioned the cost of endurance where endurance had been praised reflexively. These shifts were uneven. They did not produce consensus or uniform change. Some sought safety in stricter adherence to structure. Others leaned into engagement, accepting disruption as necessary. Both responses reflected attempts to restore balance after it had failed so completely. The story did not privilege one response over the other. It observed both, acknowledging that uncertainty invites divergence. What it did not allow was a return to unexamined assumption. Assumption had been exposed as fragile. It had allowed silence to substitute for understanding and control to substitute for connection. Its collapse reshaped perception long after the immediate shock receded. As time extended further from the event, memory softened but awareness remained. The narrative no longer dominated thought, but it surfaced when relevance was felt, when strain accumulated quietly, when control tightened, when silence felt heavy rather than restful. In those moments, the story did not intrude. It waited. It remained attentive to the quiet negotiations that shape direction long before outcomes announce themselves. It understood that futures are rarely decided in a single act, but assembled gradually through permissions granted, conversations deferred, and discomfort endured without engagement. The house still stands. The street still moves. Life continues with necessary momentum. And beneath that momentum, the story persists, unfinished, observant, accompanying ordinary lives where stability is assumed, silence is rewarded, and the unseen continues its work, shaping what comes next long before anyone believes the ordinary has begun to give way. That work continues regardless of attention. It does not require belief to function. It operates beneath awareness, shaping perception through repetition rather than persuasion. Each day that passes without engagement reinforces the belief that engagement is unnecessary. Each successful performance of stability becomes another layer of insulation. Insulation creates distance. Not physical distance, but emotional and perceptual distance. It separates what is experienced internally from what is presented externally. Over time, this separation becomes normalized. The gap itself fades from notice, even as it widens. Widening does not feel dramatic. It feels like adaptation, like learning how to function efficiently within constraint. The internal world reorganizes to accommodate what cannot be expressed, developing its own logic, its own priorities. This logic does not announce itself as deviant. It presents as practical. Practicality is persuasive. It values solutions over questions, outcomes over process. When practicality governs inner life, complexity is treated as obstacle rather than information. The impulse becomes to simplify, to reduce, to eliminate variables that complicate relief. Relief becomes the organizing principle. Not relief as rest or restoration, but relief as cessation, the end of strain rather than its resolution. Within this frame, relationships are evaluated according to the pressure they exert. What increases pressure is experienced as threat. What promises relief is experienced as necessity. Necessity narrows moral vision. It reframes consequence as collateral, responsibility as burden. The internal narrative grows increasingly self-referential, drawing authority from its own coherence rather than from shared reality. Without external challenge, this coherence hardens. Hardening reduces permeability. New information struggles to enter. Contradiction is dismissed before it is examined. The internal system becomes closed, efficient, and brittle. It cannot adapt because adaptation would require reopening questions that have already been settled internally. Settled does not mean resolved. It means fixed. Fixed interpretations do not evolve. They persist until reality intervenes with force. In this story, that intervention arrived abruptly, collapsing the internal world that had been so carefully maintained. Collapse revealed absence. Not only the absence of lives, but the absence of connection that had preceded them. The realization that shared reality had dissolved long before the event itself arrived with disorienting clarity. The final act did not create fragmentation. It exposed it. Exposure did not bring understanding immediately. It brought shock, disbelief, and the urgent need to restore meaning. The mind searched for points of failure, for moments that could explain how such divergence went unnoticed. What it found instead were patterns, quiet, sustained, and socially reinforced. Reinforcement matters. It shapes what is rewarded and what is discouraged. In environments where composure is praised and disruption frowned upon, silence gains value. Over time, this value becomes normative, shaping behavior without explicit instruction. Norms are powerful precisely because they are invisible. They feel natural, inevitable. Questioning them feels unnecessary until consequence forces reconsideration. The story demonstrates how norms that prioritize order over engagement can allow harm to mature without resistance. Resistance would have required permission. Permission to be uncertain. Permission to be dissatisfied. Permission to interrupt rhythm in service of alignment. These permissions were scarce, not because they were forbidden, but because they were unsupported. Unsupported expressions tend to retreat. They move inward where they can be managed privately. Over time, private management becomes isolation. Isolation fosters internal narratives that grow increasingly detached from shared context. Context is essential for calibration. It provides perspective, correction, and empathy. Without it, the internal world recalibrates around itself, amplifying grievance and diminishing relational awareness. This recalibration does not feel radical. It feels clarifying. Clarity achieved through reduction is misleading. It simplifies by excluding rather than integrating. The resulting certainty is fragile, dependent on the continued absence of challenge. When challenge finally arrives, it arrives as rupture rather than dialogue. Dialogue would have required earlier interruption. It would have required tolerating discomfort before it became crisis. The story does not claim that dialogue guarantees safety. It reveals only that its absence allowed the trajectory to proceed unchecked. Unchecked trajectories feel smooth. They encounter little friction. They progress quietly, guided by habit and reinforced by routine. The lack of friction is mistaken for stability, further discouraging inquiry. Inquiry disrupts momentum. It slows progress, introduces doubt, complicates identity. In systems that value efficiency, inquiry is often deferred. The cost of deferral accumulates invisibly until it becomes irreversible. Irreversibility changes everything. It collapses the distinction between before and after, leaving no path back to the moment when engagement might have altered course. What remains is consequence, permanent, unyielding. Those left to live with that consequence must reconstruct meaning carefully, not through explanation alone, but through reorientation. They must learn how to inhabit a world where certainty has been compromised, where familiar indicators no longer suffice. This reorientation is slow. It unfolds across ordinary days, shaping how people listen, how they interpret silence, how they respond to strain. It does not erase routine. It complicates it. Complication is uncomfortable but necessary. It reintroduces elasticity where rigidity once prevailed. It creates space for questions that were previously deferred. It does not resolve tension, but it prevents tension from consolidating unchecked. The story's presence persists in this space. It does not demand attention. It waits for relevance. It emerges when silence feels heavy, when control tightens reflexively, when endurance is praised without reflection. In those moments, it does not instruct. It reminds that what is carried privately continues to shape outcome. That stability requires engagement to remain humane. That ordinary days are not neutral, they are formative. And so the narrative continues alongside ordinary life, unfinished and observant, attentive to the quiet permissions granted each day, to the habits that accumulate without notice, and to the futures being assembled patiently within the familiar, long before anyone believes that the familiar has begun to fail. That assembly happens without ceremony. There are no markers to indicate when a habit becomes a hinge, when a postponement becomes a precedent, when a silence becomes structural. Each day feels like the one before it, carrying the same obligations, the same expectations, the same reassurance that nothing has fundamentally changed. The absence of alarm becomes its own confirmation. Confirmation is subtle. It does not declare correctness. It suggests sufficiency. It implies that whatever strain exists can continue to be absorbed, managed, deferred. This implication grows stronger with time, not weaker. The longer nothing collapses, the more resilient the system appears. Resilience, however, is often confused with tolerance. Tolerance allows strain to persist without response. It is mistaken for strength because it avoids disruption. In the environment surrounding this story, tolerance was reinforced repeatedly, woven into identity and obligation. To tolerate quietly was to demonstrate reliability. Reliability carried status. It was visible, measurable, rewarded. It offered a sense of purpose and belonging. Yet the emphasis on reliability left little room for revision. What could not be carried reliably had to be hidden, reinterpreted, or endured. Endurance became proof. Proof of character, proof of commitment, proof of moral alignment. The internal cost of this proof remained unacknowledged, even to the one paying it. Over time, the ledger of endurance grew unbalanced, though it was never formally kept. Unkept ledgers still matter. They influence perception, shaping how effort is valued and how sacrifice is understood. When sacrifice goes unrecognized, it transforms internally. What was once voluntary begins to feel compulsory. What was once meaningful begins to feel extractive. Extraction reframes relationship. It shifts from mutual exchange to unilateral demand. This reframing occurs quietly, often without conscious intent. The internal narrative adjusts to accommodate it, developing explanations that preserve identity while justifying withdrawal. Withdrawal does not always look like distance. It can exist within proximity, within shared schedules and shared spaces. It manifests as emotional narrowing, as reduced curiosity, as diminished tolerance for complexity. The world becomes smaller, organized around pressure points rather than possibility. Possibility requires openness. It thrives on dialogue, on the willingness to imagine multiple futures. When openness is replaced by certainty, possibility contracts. The future becomes singular, defined not by negotiation but by conclusion. Conclusion feels efficient. It promises an end to ambiguity, an escape from prolonged strain. In the internal world shaped by avoidance and endurance, efficiency becomes a moral good. The faster the strain can be eliminated, the better. This moralization of efficiency is dangerous. It prioritizes outcome over process, relief over responsibility. It does not ask what will be lost in the pursuit of resolution. Those losses remain abstract until they become irrevocable. Irreversibility arrived without warning. It severed continuity abruptly, leaving no gradual transition between before and after. The ordinary world, which had seemed so reliable, was exposed as indifferent to the boundary that had been crossed. Indifference is not intent. It is proximity without awareness. The neighborhood did not fail by being hostile. It failed by being ordinary. By continuing its rhythm uninterrupted, it underscored how thoroughly the event had been contained. Containment was complete. It had succeeded too well. Nothing escaped early enough to invite interruption. The very qualities that preserved calm also preserved concealment. After exposure, calm became impossible. The same stillness now carried weight. Silence no longer felt neutral. Familiar spaces felt charged with absence. The meaning of ordinary scenes shifted permanently. Meaning does not revert easily. Once altered, it continues to shape interpretation. A closed door no longer signifies privacy alone. A quiet evening no longer guarantees rest. These symbols acquire layers that cannot be stripped away. These layers complicate daily life. They slow interpretation, introduce hesitation, invite second looks. Life continues, but it does so with an added dimension, an awareness that surfaces may conceal divergence, that order may coexist with fracture. This awareness does not demand vigilance. It demands presence. Presence that notices drift before it consolidates. Presence that recognizes when endurance is replacing engagement. Presence that understands silence as a choice rather than a default. Choice restores agency. It reintroduces the possibility of intervention before inevitability sets in. The story does not suggest that such intervention is easy or always effective. It reveals only that its absence allowed a trajectory to complete itself unchecked. Unchecked completion leaves no space for repair. Repair requires time, dialogue, and uncertainty. Once completion occurs, only consequence remains. Consequence does not negotiate. It reshapes everything it touches. Those reshaped must find new ways to live, not by resolving what happened, but by integrating its implications. Integration is slow and uneven. It unfolds across ordinary moments, shaping how people listen, how they respond to strain, how they evaluate calm. Evaluation becomes ongoing. There is no final assessment that restores certainty. Instead, there is attentiveness, a sustained awareness that stability is not self-sustaining, that alignment requires. The quiet that follows does not resolve itself into peace. It settles into permanence. Time continues, but it moves with altered weight. Days still begin and end. Streets still fill and empty. Yet the sense of ordinary progression has been permanently complicated by the knowledge that what appeared stable once concealed a rupture vast enough to erase an entire family. The world did not change its rhythm in response. Only perception did. Perception is what carries the aftermath forward. It lingers in how silence is heard, in how composure is interpreted, in how certainty is granted. What once felt reassuring now invites pause. Familiar patterns no longer guarantee safety. They require attention. The story does not replace trust with fear. It replaces assumption with awareness. Awareness is heavier than assumption. It asks more of those who carry it. It demands that endurance be questioned, not admired reflexively. It requires that control be examined for brittleness as well as strength. It insists that silence be understood as a choice with consequence, not a neutral absence. The house remains where it has always been. Its walls still stand. Its rooms still hold light and shadow, yet it no longer functions as a private space. It has become a symbol without intention, a reminder that devastation does not require disorder, that violence can coexist with meticulous routine, that familiarity can be an effective veil. What happened inside that house was not preceded by spectacle. There were no alarms audible to the outside world, no visible collapse. The conditions that allowed the tragedy to unfold were woven into ordinary life so thoroughly that they escaped notice. Discipline, order, faith in structure, each operated as expected. None appeared excessive until excess revealed itself through consequence. Consequence does not argue. It does not justify itself or explain its arrival. It exists as absence, as finality, as the irrevocable shift from what was assumed to what is now known. In this case, consequence forced recognition that alignment cannot be inferred from appearance alone. Alignment requires exchange. It depends on dialogue, on the willingness to expose strain before it hardens, on the courage to disrupt routine in service of truth. The absence of this exchange allowed internal narratives to mature in isolation, protected by performance and reinforced by expectation. Expectation shapes behavior quietly. It teaches what is rewarded and what is discouraged without instruction. In environments where composure is praised and disruption avoided, silence gains value. Over time, this value becomes normative, discouraging engagement precisely when it is most needed. Need does not announce itself clearly. It arrives as fatigue, as irritation, as narrowing tolerance for ambiguity. When these signals are managed privately rather than addressed relationally, they reorganize the internal world. Endurance becomes obligation. Obligation becomes resentment. Resentment becomes justification. Justification narrows moral vision. It reframes relief as necessity and consequence as collateral. Within this narrowed frame, alternatives that require vulnerability or negotiation lose visibility. The future becomes singular, defined by resolution rather than repair. Repair requires patience with uncertainty. It requires tolerating discomfort without rushing to conclusion. In this story, patience was directed toward endurance rather than engagement. The difference between these two orientations proved decisive. Endurance preserved appearance. Engagement might have preserved connection. The distinction is subtle, and that subtlety is where the story continues to reside. It does not reside in the act alone, but in the long sequence of choices that preceded it, choices that felt reasonable, responsible, even virtuous at the time. Virtue, when unexamined, can become rigid. Rigidity resists adaptation. It values preservation over responsiveness. When systems become rigid, they cannot absorb misalignment without breaking. In the Coleman case, rigidity maintained form until form itself became the container for devastation. Afterward, rebuilding did not restore certainty. It introduced humility. A recognition that knowing someone well is not a static achievement, but an ongoing process. That stability must be sustained through engagement, not inferred from consistency. That silence, while sometimes protective, can also be corrosive. This humility did not spread uniformly. Some sought reassurance in tighter structure, in clearer rules, in stricter adherence to order. Others leaned into attentiveness, allowing discomfort to inform engagement. Both responses emerged from the same rupture, reflecting different needs for safety in the aftermath of certainty's collapse. The story does not resolve this divergence. It observes it. It understands that uncertainty invites multiple strategies for restoration. What it does not permit is a return to unexamined assumption. Assumption was the quiet accomplice here. It allowed ordinary life to proceed uninterrupted while internal fracture deepened. Its collapse reshaped how calm is interpreted, how endurance is valued, how control is trusted. As years pass, details soften. Dates blur. Specifics recede. What remains is atmosphere, a persistent awareness that harm can develop without chaos, that devastation can grow within order, that silence can accumulate power when left unchallenged. This awareness does not dominate daily life. It surfaces intermittently in moments of strain when routine tightens and patience thins. It appears when speaking feels risky and waiting feels easier. In those moments, the story is present, not as command or accusation, but as context. Context that reminds that what is unspoken continues to act. That what is endured in isolation reshapes outcome. That futures are not forged in dramatic acts alone, but assembled patiently through habits, permissions, and postponements that feel ordinary while they are happening. The neighborhood continues. Children grow. Work resumes. Faith communities gather. Life, insistent and unrelenting, moves forward. Yet beneath that movement, the narrative remains unfinished, observant, quiet. It waits in the spaces where certainty feels comfortable. It lingers where control is praised without inquiry. It watches where silence is chosen because it feels responsible. And it continues to hold this truth without declaring it aloud, that stability is not the absence of disturbance, but the presence of engagement, and that when engagement is deferred long enough, the cost of silence is eventually paid in permanence.